Hey guys, it's Loaf, and I am back with another Last Epoch build guide. This time around with the Skele Pop Necromancer. So I'm actually resurrecting a old build of mine that I'd made about 2.5 years ago. That was kind of a fan favorite. So a lot has changed in that last 2.5 years, both with skills, passives, and new items being introduced to the game. So I really wanted to see how this build has aged over the years and what changes we could make to it to bring it more a little bit more up to date. So that's what the build's going to be centered around: is exploding our own skeletons for damage, doing these massive necrotic pops. So I'm going to have some different planners set up in the video description for you. So I'll have a full unique setup with playing low life, as well as a zero unique setup, just playing full HP stacker with some ward synergies as well. They're basically the same setup, both skill and passive wise, just some difference in the gear. So this build is one of the best kind of starter necro builds that you can do. All of its problems are solved within its own skills and passives, so it's a really good starter build to set up, and it transitions very well into some of the higher end necro builds. For instance, the Harbor Mage. So to be upfront, it's not going to be doing billions of damage per second like Harbor Mage is. Nothing's going to get close to Harbor Mage. It's by far the highest DPS build out there that's going to smash content. However, a lot of people are getting bored of that playstyle and want to try something new and exciting, or want a build that can help transition them to that point before they have all the gear to set up the Harbor Mage. And I think this is a really good intro into that. So I just want to be upfront with it, let you guys know the realistic expectations. It has respectable damage, respectable tankiness, and it's going to get you, 500 plus corruption just fine. So as long as you guys are okay with that, then it's a really good option for you guys to try out. I will also include a very in-depth loot filter system and everything you need to make this build succeed. Like all of my build guides, if you've been around before, it is a very long video. I apologize, but this is more set up to be a one-stop shop for everything you're going to need in the build to succeed. So don't plan on sitting through and watching this video from start to finish in one session. This is more a wiki page for the build. It's going to have in-depth timestamps, jump around to where you need to be or what questions you have to get those answered, and then keep playing the build. If you have anything else, come back to the video and check it out. I'm sure the answer will be there for you. If it's not, feel free to leave a comment, ask some questions. I'm happy to get to all of those comments for you and make sure that you're set up for success. But if you guys do enjoy the content, consider leaving a like. It helps with the algorithm on YouTube. Or if you want to see more of the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll have plenty of other builds coming out for you. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the build guide. Alrighty, guys, let's go ahead and go over the skills so you can get kind of a basic understanding on how the build functions and what kind of scaling that we're looking for. So that way the rest of the build makes sense when we're going over the passives. So the bread and butter of this build is centered around Summon Skeleton. So what Summon Skeleton does by default is you press it and it pulls up a skeleton from the ground, and you are originally limited to having 3 skeletons at a time. So there are 2 default types of skeletons. You have skeleton warriors and skeleton archers. The warriors are going to be a sword and board melee type skeleton, while the archers are obviously going to have bows and shoot enemies from range. At the beginning, you're limited to 3. It's always going to give you 2 of one type and 1 of the other. So if you are early leveling and you want to have like 2 rangers and currently have 2 warriors, just hit the summon skeleton button again. It will sacrifice one of those warriors and give you a summon skeleton archer. Like all my builds there, I'm going to have the slider set up at the bottom to show you the progression on when you should take what points here for you. So we'll kind of go through that really quick and explain all of the nodes. So the first 2 nodes are going to be a necrotic conviction. That's going to give your warriors 30% extra health and your archers 30% extra damage. It's going to give us access to the Hollow Walkers node. That is going to increase that maximum number of skeletons from 3 now to 4. So now when you're summoning your skeletons, it is always going to give you 2 of archers and 2 summoned skeletal warriors. After that, we're going to be taking 2 points into Unbound Necromancy. This is going to give your Summon Skeleton ability 40% mana efficiency, and then give all of your skeletons 2% base crit. Now, this build is centered around the main spam button being Summon Skeleton, as we are going to be sacrificing our own skeletons after the beginning stages of the build. So having this mana efficiency here is very, very important. So we can just cover all of the mana problems within this skill tree. We don't have to stack mana regen anywhere on the build or do any other tricks for mana. It's all going to come from this skill tree. Now that we have taken those 2 points, we're going to be taking 1 point over to Gravewalkers. That's going to change the maximum number of summoned skeletons from 4 now to 5. Next, the point we're going to be taking is Shambling Steel. What this is going to do is remove the archers from the pool, and now all of our summoned skeletons are going to be summoned skeletal warriors. That's going to get really important once we gain access to the summoned skeletal mage tree, which is going to be triggering the explosions from our skeletons. You can only explode a certain type of skeletons, and archers are one of the ones that can't explode. So that's why we're going to be taking those out of the pool. So we are left only with summoned skeletal warriors. Alrighty, next we're going to be taking 1 point for now into Soul Catcher. What this does, it gives you 10 ward anytime one of your skeletons die. But for now, it's mainly just a travel point so we can get over to Mind Catcher. So now you gain mana whenever one of your summoned skeletals warriors die. So it gives you 15 mana back when they die. That's what I was talking about earlier when the entire mana situation is going to be completely solved within this tree. This is going to be a really big node. Since we're constantly killing off our own skeleton warriors, they're now going to be constantly giving us mana back, covering a majority of that upfront mana cost. Next, we'll be finishing out the points into Unbound Necromancy, just making the mana efficiency much higher. And then we'll be taking the 2 points into Unholy Rage. At this point of the build, you should have already gotten access to Summon Skeletal Mage, and you're going to start sacrificing your own minions. So you actually don't care about the attack and cast speed of your Summon Skeletal Warriors themselves anymore. However, the move speed is kind of nice, so they can run at enemies, so they're easier to explode on top of them. Main reason, though, is going to give us access to Morrow Walkers, which is, again, going to give us another +1 summon skeleton, so that way we can have a lot larger pool of them at once for our mages to explode. Okay, after that, we're going to be taking 1 travel point to Morrow Tap. We don't care about the defenses of the Summon Skeletal Warrior at all, since they're just going to be repeatedly dying over and over, but that does give us access to Empty the Graves. What this does is it makes it so instead of casting 1 summon skeleton at a time, it's going to cast 3 at a time at the cost of amplifying the mana cost by 220%. We'll still be able to sustain the mana, no problem there with that. But now we're going to be getting our damage out a lot faster. So instead of doing 1 explosion per cast of Summon Skeletal Warrior, we're now doing 3 explosions per cast. And then for the last point with the first 20 levels before you get gear that gives you extra levels on your Summon Skeleton, you're going to be putting another node into Soul Catcher. With how many warriors we have dying, getting that extra ward every time one of them dies is really nice. And so that will wrap up the original 20 points that you're going to get. With some better gear, with the relic and getting some levels on the chest piece, if you can get that slam, we are going to be able to get access to some extra levels. So the first 2 levels, you're going to fill out Soul Catcher, so now you're getting 40 ward every time one of your Summoned Skeletal Warriors die. And then for the remaining 3 points, we're going to be putting them into Immortal. What this does is when one of your skeletons explodes from your mage, you have a 20% chance to just summon a new Summon Skeletal Warrior for you. This is going to make the playstyle a lot more relaxed once you get access to these nodes, because you're not going to have to summon every Skeleton Warrior yourself. After a while, you're just going to summon up your maximum amount, and they're going to kind of self-sustain for a while, and then eventually they'll peter out and you'll do a couple more casts, and then they'll keep going and doing their own thing again. So just a lot of quality of life with this node and making the mana management a little bit easier as well. And then that's going to wrap up the Summon Skeleton tree here for us. Alright, for the second skill, we have Summon Skeletal Mage. This is where all of our damage is coming from. So we are not scaling the character damage at all. We are scaling all of the Skeletal Mage damage, as the Summon Skeletal Mage is going to be the minion that's actually exploding all of the Summon Skeletal Warriors. So to start it out, by default, you summon a mage, and you are limited to 2 skeletal mages at a time. And they, by default, will do a ability called Dreadbolt, which does necrotic damage on hit. So how we are going to level up the summon skeletal mage is we are going to start by putting 2 points into Cellar Mortis. What this does is it gives them 6% base crit, and it gives them a little bit of extra movement speed. We're only going to put 2 points into there for now. I know most Necromancer builds tap out this ability. However, later on, we're going to have a way to get 100% crit chance on our mages by default. We don't need to invest too heavily into this. But what it does do is it gives us access to Grey Merchant. What Grey Merchant does is it gives you 30% crit multi, but then it also gives you maximum health gained on crit for your Summon Skeleton Mage. That is a massive node. So it's not just a leech that applies over 3 seconds. It is actually giving them a full percentage of their maximum health just instantly back to them. This is one of the strongest healing nodes for any minion in the game. And so if you just stack enough health for your Summon Skeletal Mage, he is going to just have insane stability there with being able to regain his health. So it's a really big node to help keeping them alive. After that, we are going to be getting into the points that make the build work. So we're going to be putting 2 points temporarily into Gravetide. That's going to give the mages +6 flat spell damage, which is really important. And then this is the node that the entire build centers around, Underlings. So skeletal mages now cast Profane Ablation on your skeleton warriors, rogues, and vanguards, sacrificing them to deal necrotic damage to surrounding enemies. So that is that big green explosion that you saw at the beginning of the video that was constantly being cast, that was blowing up the Summon Skeletal Warriors and Vanguards for the setup. We don't do any rogues for this build. This build used to, 2.5 years ago, make Skeletal Mages cast Sacrifice, which was a physical damage spell. So a couple of changes with that, and this is actually a massive buff to the build. So the reason why is Sacrifice, when it was casting Sacrifice, it wasn't benefiting from the Sacrifice tree, because the Sacrifice tree only is working if you are the one casting it. But since it was being cast by the mage, it didn't matter, and now our mages were just casting this physical spell, which there wasn't as much synergy for with both gear and passives. Almost all of the necro passives are set up around doing necrotic damage. So one gave it a higher flat damage for Profane Ablation. It gave it higher additive damage scaling, and it also made it necrotic damage. So now we have more synergies for scaling. So massive buff with this rework on this skill. Plus, it just looks way cooler than Sacrifice does with that kind of green explosion tint. So once we get to this point, now you'll just be spam casting Summon Skeleton for your damage, and then your mages will just walk around and start exploding them for you. The really good part about this is you don't really need to aim the skeletal warriors if you don't want to. The mages will only cast this ability once the Summon Skeletal Warriors are on top of the target. So you can cast it directly on them if you want, just for the instant damage. But if you want to be lazy, you can just cast the warriors anywhere. The warriors will automatically run to the nearest enemy anyways, and then your mages will wait until they're right next to them and then explode them. After that, we'll be finishing putting out the points into Gravetide, so we get up to +15 flat damage for the mages, which is really big. We have really good additive scaling for Profane Ablation. And then next we'll be rushing over to taking 1 point into Splinter Dominion. We don't actually care about the extra projectiles. I know most of the builds that center around mages try to fill the screen with projectiles. If you have Summon Skeletal Warriors active, they will always prioritize Profane Ablation over doing their default attack. So they should actually never be using their normal projectiles as long as you have warriors available for them to explode. So we're going to be going over here to this node where it gives us 20% cast speed. Cast speed is the #1 stat that we're looking to scale on the mages, because we can cast a lot faster typically than they can for those explosions. So I want them to be consuming those warriors as fast as possible. So that's how we're going to do that. All right, so for the next point, we're going to be putting into Archmage. Now, the original version of the build I did by scaling a whole bunch of mages, and you can technically get a lot more explosions out for better clear. by doing a whole bunch of mages. However, Archmage is substantially better if you are pushing into higher corruptions because it gets 130% multiplicative health. So that's not just a random node like you'd have on your gear that gives you 130% increased health for your minion. This multiplies all of the other health stats that we're going to be getting for the mage, which allows him to be tanky enough to actually survive in high-end content. The build is going to feel really, really easy to do for a while, doing a bunch of the mages until you hit about 300 corruption. And then there's going to be area spells from a lot of minions that are just going to randomly one-shot the mages. The mages have an insane sustain with all of their health leech nodes that they're going to be getting. So if they don't get one shot, they immediately heal back to full. However, it's just way too much investment to try to get them tanky enough to survive those big one shots by themselves. So I feel like it is kind of forced at higher corruption to go into Archmage, get that health multiplier. On top of that, it becomes a lot easier to get some other synergies with Dreadshade, getting 100% crit, and getting a lot more damage because you're getting also 130% damage multiplier on top of everything. So we're going to be going into Archmage for that reason. For the next point, we're going to be putting 1 point into Cryomancer. Now, we are not taking the point into Frostlich. That is very important. There is a unique that we're going to be using eventually that is going to give us +3 to necrotic minions and cold minions. And that is important with this node because it doesn't remove the regular mages from the tree. It only adds cryomancers to the tree. And what this does is it makes it, you can see right here, the skill becomes a cold skill and a necrotic skill. So instead of giving us +3 points to the skill tree, it's going to give us +6 points to the skill tree, which is really, really big. And we actually don't really care if it's a cold mage or a necrotic mage because the base attack's not going to matter. It's going to be necrotic damage no matter what with Profane Ablation. So that's why we don't take this node, even though it gives us 20% increased damage. All right, so that's going to put us at the default 20 points in the tree. Once you get the one unique item, you're going to get the other 6 points, and then another unique item will give you that additional +1. So if you're just starting out the game, you don't have any unique items, this is what the tree is going to look like. But after that, what we are going to be doing is we're going to be putting the 4 points into Shadow Wardens. I don't care about the ward per second at all. What this does give us is 100% critical strike avoidance for your mages. The hardest part with scaling this build in the end game is keeping the mage alive, and this will drastically help you do that. After that, we're going to be putting 4 points into Forbidden Arcana. What that does is it gives you 3% more damage per 25 max mana. So more damage goes in at the end of the calculation for damage. So it adds up all different damage stats, and then it grabs your more damage and adds that all on top of it. So we're not actually scaling any mana for this build with how I have everything set up, but just with your default 100 mana, that is a massive multiplier. So you're essentially getting 12% more damage on top of everything. And then that will wrap up the Summon Skeletal Mage. For the third skill, we have Dreadshade. Dreadshade is by far the #1 most broken ability on Necromancer. It's why every single Necromancer uses it. So the reason why is how it works by default is you place it on top of one of your minions and it gives them an AoE buff that buffs themselves and all the minions around them. So what it does is it makes it so your minion's health is drained for 3% of its maximum health per second for each second Shade has been active. But it gives you 10 flat necrotic damage with spells and attacks to your minions, and then 50% increased necrotic damage. So already just a whole bunch of flat damage for free just with the base skill itself. How we're going to be leveling this is we are going to start out with 2 points into Spectral Presence. That's going to increase the Aura of Effect, where it's affecting more of your minions by 50%. But more importantly, it's going to give us access to Lone Watcher. What Lone Watcher does is it makes it so it no longer applies that 3% health drain to the minion, which is really, really big. That helps our survivability a lot. And then it increases the Shade's duration by 100%. So you're not going to be able to applying it as often. You're only going to have to apply it like typically 3 times an echo. You just click this little buff button. It's pretty easy to manage. The downside, though, is it makes it so you can only have 1 maximum Dread Shade, which, as we went through the Summon Skeleton, the Skeleton's the only one we care about being affected by this buff. And once we take Archmage, we only have one minion anyway, so we only need one maximum Dreadshade. And the other downside is it changes the health drain to increase damage taken. So eventually they're going to take more and more damage, but it's really not that big of a deal. With our sustain, we're able to manage that just fine. After that, we'll be grabbing the 4 points into Lingering Doom. That's going to reduce the health decay that's coming through, which doesn't matter since we're getting rid of the health decay, but it gives them an additional 12 flat necrotic damage. So now we're getting 22 flat necrotic damage just from having this buff there, which is a massive multiplier. After that, I'll be taking 1 point into Blind Fury. Now, there's going to be a little bit of confusion with this node. So it gives you 40% increased cast speed for your Summon Skeletal Mage, which, like I said earlier, is really big, but it comes with a downside where it blinds your enemy. It blinds your minion. And what blind does is it makes it so you are less likely to crit enemies, and it makes it so you're more likely to randomly miss your attacks. Now, this downside is completely fixed on this build. So the missing attacks portion doesn't actually apply to Profane Ablation. We still have a 100% chance to explode our own minion because we're not actually targeting an enemy from it. So that part is just negated completely. And then here in a second, having the reduced crit chance isn't going to matter either, and I'll show you guys why. So after we grab that node, we will be going and taking the node over here, All for One. So now we can no longer make an aura that affects our other minions, and since we are doing the singular mage, that doesn't matter, but it gives us a 40% damage multiplier on top of that. And then it also gives us access to this node here, which makes minions always crit. So it doesn't give us a increased chance to crit, it just gives them a guaranteed chance to crit, which is going to fix the other portion of Blind Fury. So now having that less crit chance doesn't matter at all. We're guaranteed to crit as long as they have a Dreadshade on the Summon Skeletal Mage. It does add a 18-second cooldown to Dreadshade, but that doesn't matter. It's more than enough time to have 100% uptime on Dreadshade on your minion, and it even gives you like a 10-second window after it's come back off cooldown before you have to place it on there. So you don't have to worry about doing it right away. You have quite a bit of leeway on getting that done. Next up, we will be taking the 3 points into Dying Coven for the 24% increased cast speed. We went over how important cast speed is. After that, we'll be taking 2 points for now into Grim Fate, which is going to give us another 30% multiplier on damage. And then 1 point into the node that allows it to affect us. So you are now affected by the beneficial buffs of Dreadshade. I know there's some confusion with that since we are doing the All for One node that makes it so there's no aura buff. But if you read it closely, it says Dreadshade grants the targeted minion significantly more damage, but Dreadshade no longer buffs other minions. So this will still affect you, and the benefit of that is it gives you a whole bunch of extra cast speed, so you're able to summon those skeletal mages a lot smoother. You're not stuck in that animation for a long time. After grabbing that, we'll grab the remaining 2 points into Grim Fate for the extra 30% damage multiplier there. And then for the last 3 points, we'll be putting them into Flesh Harvest. What this will do is it'll give you increased buff effect if your minion is missing health at all. So there's not a whole lot of other points that would really make sense for us to take. So this will just occasionally give them a little bit more effect from all of these different nodes. And then that will wrap up the Dreadshade skill tree. For the next skill, we're going to have Summon Volatile Zombie. So the next 2 skills that we're going to be looking at, they're actually going to be completely automated. So it's not even a skill that we have on the action bar, as I'm sure you've noticed in the video. So that gives us access to use like a base transplant. So I know a lot of people probably saw the skills and were like, oh my gosh, she's not running a teleport. So that's how I'm using my teleport there. It's just the base transplant because I don't have to have these next 2 skills on my bar at all. So how Summon Volatile Zombie normally works is you summon a zombie, it comes up from the ground, it runs over to the nearest enemy, and then it explodes, dealing physical and fire damage to surrounding enemies. So our Summon Volatile Zombie is going to do a decent amount of damage, but it's mainly going to be a utility skill. And we'll get into that as we go through the leveling progression. So the first point is going to go over to Path of Destruction. this is going to make the explosion that the zombie does increase by 25%. However, this is just going to be a triple node. The next point is Necromantic Fervor. What this does is it makes it so you are healed for a portion of the zombie's maximum health when they explode. Um, we're going to be stacking quite a bit of minion health on all of our gear for our mage anyways, so their health pool is actually going to get up to a pretty heavy amount, and that's going to add a pretty big heal for us. And because eventually this build is going to be low life, we're going to be taking this next node, Vital Ward, which now grants all of the healing that it would have applied and then transfers it over to Ward for you. So that way you're not messing up the low life synergies and you're just adding to that extra amount of Ward pool that you're able to acquire. Next up, we'll get into the automation part of the build, where we're taking 3 points into Awakening Presence. What this does is it makes it so when a minion dies, you have a chance to cast Volatile Zombie at its location, expending its mana cost. So we have a 30% chance whenever a minion dies to cast a free Volatile Zombie. They had nerfed this node a while back, where it used to be able to proc itself, so zombies would proc more zombies, and now that they changed that so it only procs off other minion death, it makes it a lot of harder to actually trigger this. For a lot of builds. However, for our build, it is perfect because we are spam killing our own summon skeletal warriors, which is constantly going to be summoning more zombies that are then going to explode and give us a whole bunch of that extra reward. After that, we'll be taking a couple of travel points here. So we're going to be taking 2 points into Forceful Commander. This node is fairly good because it gives us 24% mana efficiency, so it's costing us a little bit less mana to get these out. The summoning speed doesn't matter since we're never going to be manually summoning them. We'll then be taking 1 travel point to Daunting Blast, the 1 point into Ravenous, which makes the explosions deal more damage to boss and rares, which isn't bad, but mainly still a travel point. And then we'll be taking the 2 points into Pull of the Grave. What that does is it gives us a kill threshold for this build. So anytime a zombie explodes on an enemy that has 16% or less HP, it instantly kills them. And then that also applies to like pinnacle bosses. So if you're killing a Shade of Orbis and he's got less than 16% health, it's just going to instantly kill him when the zombie explodes on top of him. After that, we'll be taking 1 point into Horrific Vessels. What this does is it fully converts the zombie's physical and fire damage over to necrotic damage. We're scaling a lot of our necrotic damage already, so that is going to amplify the amount of damage that the volatile zombie is doing. But the big part, like I said, for the Summon Skeletal Mage, is we have an item that's giving us +3 levels to cold and necrotic skills for minions. So this makes the Summon Volatile Zombie count as a necrotic minion, which now gives us an additional 3 levels on top of that for the skill tree. Next up, this is the part that is going to automate our last skill, is we're going to be taking 4 points into Effigy of Combustion. What this does is when a zombie dies, they have a chance to automatically cast an Infernal Shade on an enemy near the zombie. And then Infernal Shades cast this way cost 50% less mana. So that will be important later on. I'm not going to get too much into it, but that will be a very good synergy with our last skill. After that, we'll be taking 2 points into Fervor. That's going to give us a multiplier on the zombie damage, but more importantly, it's going to give him 16% movement speed. Now that we got all the kind of utility skills out of the way for the zombie, our main goal now is to make the zombie move as fast as possible, because we want him to go from being resurrected to instantly exploding on an enemy as fast as he possibly can. So that 16% movement speed is really big. And then we'll be taking the 1 point into Ferocious Horde. What that does is it gives them increased movement speed per 1% of missing health. And then by default, zombies start decaying their own health as they are brought into existence. And then this will also give you a 30% increased health decay. So they're going to be rapidly losing their health faster, and then that's going to be giving them increased movement speed so they can run to the nearest minion or enemy as fast as possible and explode. After that, we'll be taking 1 travel point into Grave Attunement. I know that gives them 15% reduced movement speed, but the reason why is it gives us access to Giant Zombie. What that does is it gives you a chance for your zombies to get resurrected to be a Giant Zombie, which gives them 100% more health, which is multiplicative on top of their normal health, which is going to make the nodes over here from Vital Ward and Necromantic Fervor give you a crap ton more ward when they die. So that's why we're going for that node. And then after that, we'll be putting the remaining points into Forceful Commander just for that increased mana efficiency. And then that will wrap up the Summon Volatile zombie tree. For our last skill, it is going to be Infernal Shade. Like we had said previously, our automated zombies are also going to automate this skill by auto casting it, so you will never have to touch the skill. It doesn't even go on your skill bar. What Infernal Shade does by default is it targets an enemy, and all nearby enemies take fire damage per second. That part doesn't really matter all that much. Infernal Shade is not going to be doing damage for us in any way. How we are going to be setting this up is we're going to be putting the first 3 points into Influence. That will increase the area of Infernal Shade. However, these are just travel points to give us access to Devour in Flames. What that does is it makes Infernal Shade can now only be attached to your minions. It does make it so your minions also take the damage from Infernal Shade, but because we're not scaling much of your damage, all of your damage scaling is going to your minions, and it's fire damage, it's not going to be really doing all of that much damage to your minions. And our mage has so much sustain, he's just going to out heal this node. Now, the purpose for that and why we want our minions to be targeted by Infernal Shade is these next 3 nodes here. So the first one we're going to be taking is Subjugation. What this does is it makes it so your minions gain damage for each second that the Infernal Shade has been active. And it gives us up to a 180% multiplier on top of our mage's damage. After that, we'll be taking the point here, Soulfire, which now makes it so Infernal Shades last forever. So that way we can make sure we're getting access to the 180% damage multiplier that it's applying. And then for the next node, we'll be going into Burn Trail. What that's going to do is give your minions haste while they have Infernal Shade acted to them, which haste will give them 30% movement speed. So that'll make it much easier for your mages to keep up with you. So that way they're not slogging behind super far, just trying to keep up and never actually casting anything. Our mage will have insane movement speed, so he can zip up to where you're at and then instantly start exploding the summon skeletal warriors. For the next 3 nodes, we're going to be taking them into Manic Pyre. What that does is it's going to give them an additional 12% movement speed and then 12% cast speed per second, up to a maximum of 72. So that's 72% more cast speed, which, like we had talked about earlier, is insane for our mages. After that, we'll be taking 2 travel points into Cackling Flames. That increases the duration of Infernal Shade, but because of the node with Soulfire, that doesn't matter. It's already infinite. But what it does give us access to is Flight of Fire. That's going to increase the number of maximum shades that can be active by 1. The reason why that is important is you can have a max of 4 shades by default. Now, with the zombies automatically casting these shades constantly whenever they die, it's going to be putting out new Infernal Shades constantly, which we're going to have a lot more than 4 minions active at any time. Once you have everything set up properly, you're going to have up to 9 summoned skeletal warriors plus your mage. That's 10 minions. And so I don't want it to be pulling off the Infernal Shade off my mage very often there. And so when we only have 4 active shades, if we have an active shade on our skeletal mage and then a zombie dies and it places a new Infernal Shade, it may just pull off the Infernal Shade off of our mage, which we want to avoid. This brings us up to 5 maximum shades. And then next we'll be putting the 5 points into Ignition here for the 35% mana efficiency. Because of the zombie node, it does help a little bit with the mana, but this mana is still going to be pretty intensive if it's constantly being cast, especially with one of the nodes that we're going to be taking here in a second. That's going to amplify its mana cost. So having those ignition nodes is very important. Next, we'll be taking 1 travel point to Wildfires. It makes the Infernal Shade deal more damage and with reduced duration, which doesn't matter at all. And then we'll be taking 1 point into Legion for an additional 1 maximum shade. So we'll have a shade count of 6 shades. So we should be able to keep those maximum or those shades on the mage like 85-90% of the time. It'll have a pretty high uptime on him. Since the Summon Skeletal Warriors are dying so fast, a lot of times they don't get a chance to actually get the Infernal Shades placed onto them. but this will just help keep those percentages higher for us to keep it on the mage as much as possible. We don't put 2 points into this tree because the amplified mana cost actually becomes way too much with 2. So we just can only afford the 1 since it adds an 85% increase in mana cost. And then that is going to wrap up all of the skills for this build. Hopefully is starting to make sense on how things are synergizing together. And then as we go through the passives and gear slots, it will make a lot more sense on kind of how everything fits together for you. Next up, I want to go over the passives for the build. Now, I know there is 2 planners. There is a full low life ward setup planner and a HP stacking planner. However, the passive trees are actually exactly the same because we are still synergizing with ward on top of the HP, even without any of the unique items. So it still will give you a couple thousand ward to kind of buffer out that HP until you get access to the low life uniques. So keep that in mind. You don't really need to switch anything between the 2 builds. So as well as the skills, we will also have a slider here for the passives to kind of show you the progression on when you should be taking which node. So for the first 8 points, we're going into Forbidden Knowledge. That's going to give us 8 intelligence and 40% necrotic res. Intelligence is very big for this build because not only does it give us ward retention to help keep our ward pool up higher, but intelligence also gives our minions flat HP, which most nodes only give minions percentile HP. So it gives us flat HP as well as percentile damage for our minions. So it's kind of a trifecta node here where it's giving us a whole bunch of synergy. So we'll be taking a lot of intelligence on this build. And the free res is also very nice. After that, we'll be taking the 5 points into Dark Rituals. This will give our mages an additional 20% cast speed. And then as well as that applies to us if we've used a minion skill recently, which we'll always be using minion skills with Summon Skeletal Warrior. So we'll be getting that extra 20% cast speed as well. For the next points, we'll be taking 1 point into Stolen Vitality, just to give a little bit further into the skill row here. That'll give us a little bit of health as well as giving our minions health. And then we'll take 1 travel point into Mania of Mortality. Now, I know this node sounds really good when a lot of people are reading it. Whenever a nearby enemy, ally, or minion dies, you have a chance to gain ward. However, the chance does not scale with more points. So it gives us a 10% chance to gain 13 ward per minion death. And that is a 10-point node, so it's just a lot of wasted points. I've done a lot of testing with it, both in the past and with the current setup for the build. And it just doesn't really give you a lot of word, so it sounds better than it actually is. We are only going to take the 1 point there. After that, we'll be taking the 5 points over into Unnatural Preservation. That's going to give us an additional 40% word retention, 20% necrotic res, and 20% poison res. After that, we'll be taking the 1 point into Soul Aegis. What this will do is your minions have additional armor per character level. So at level 100, it's going to give your mage an additional 300 armor, just helping him stay alive a lot better. And that's going to wrap up the base Acolyte tree. And then next we will be moving in to the Necromancer tree. For the first 5 points, we're going to be putting them into Arisen Army. That's going to give the minions 20% damage as well as 10% increase cast speed and give us access to the second row. After that, we'll be finishing out the 8 points into Risen Army for the additional damage, and then we'll be putting points into Cursed Blood. We're only going to be putting 3 points in there because it's giving us percentile necrotic damage, and that's not multiplicative or more, so it really doesn't do a whole lot, but those 3 points will be important for a later node once we get access to it. After that, we will be putting 1 travel point into Blood Armor, giving our minions health regen per second. I don't really care about health regen at all because mages get such an insane amount of leech coming through from their tree that this basically does nothing for us. What it does give us access to is the 5 points into Mortal Tether for an extra 75% increase minion health, and it'll give us access to another point there later on as well. And then next we'll be putting the 8 points into one of the most busted nodes on the passive tree, which is Aegis Fall. What this does is it gives your minions a chance to shred armor on hit. So it gives them 200% chance to shred armor on hit. So that's going to count from the projectiles the mages is summoning. The profane ablations are going to be shredding armor. The summoned skeletal warriors, even though they have do almost no damage with their melee attacks, those melee attacks are still going to be shredding 2 armor stacks every single time. All of your zombies are going to be applying this. So you're going to have a crap ton of shred just for free from all of your minions. So really, really strong node. After that, we'll be putting 1.2 Unbound Necromancy. That's going to increase the total cap of your Summoned Skeletal Warriors by an additional point. And then we will be putting the point into Mark of Punishment. So what happens with this node here is whenever one of your minions die, it has a chance to mark the nearest enemy for death for 5 seconds. What Mark for Death does is it reduces all of those enemies' resistances by 25%. We really only need like 1 to 2 points in this node for that 10% chance because we're killing so many of our own minions, both with the warriors and the zombies, that it should apply to any tanky monster that's taking more than 1 to 2 explosions. They should have this mark on them permanently. All right, next up, we're going to be putting 3 points into Dark Retribution. This is one of the other things that had changed with the updates that have happened in the last 2.5 years with the build. So whenever one of your minions die, all the time, you have a chance to summon a skeletal vanguard from its corpse, a minion that does melee physical damage, yada yada yada. This skeletal vanguard is basically a skeleton warrior. Now, before, with the profane ablation node, when it used to be a sacrifice, it used to only apply to skeletal warriors and rogues. It couldn't actually apply to the vanguards. Now they've made it so it does apply to the vanguards. So this is basically just an additional 3 skeletal warriors that can be sacrificed to explode. And however, these skeletal vanguards, because they are not technically a skeletal warrior, they don't apply to the maximum number of skeletal warriors. They have their own maximum number. So you can have an additional 3 skeletons from this node right here. Next up, we'll be taking the 5 points into Reclamation of Souls. That's going to give us an additional 35% ward retention, as well as 35 ward on minion deaths. That's guaranteed ward every time a minion dies. It's not a percentage to proc. And that applies to all the minions, not just the Summoned Skeletal Warriors. Next up, we'll be taking the 3 points into Tyrant for now. That's going to reduce your minion's health by 9%. All of the minion nodes that give them minion health give them an insane amount of health. Like if you get 1 node on a piece of gear that's tier 5, it's like 150% increased health. So that 9% reduced health is going to do almost nothing for them, but 9% increased health for you is actually really, really big. So that's why we're taking those. It's also going to give us access to the Tyrant Legion node here. So we're only putting 1 point in it. We don't care about the physical pen or the poison pen from the skeletal warriors. What we do care about is the maximum number of skeletons it gives us for having 1 point into here. Next, we will be taking the 1 point for now into Frantic Summons. That will give us increased minion cast speed. And then we'll be taking the 5 points into River of Bones. Now, what this does is it gives our minions a 100% critical strike chance, which I'm sure you're saying, hey, we already get 100% critical strike chance from Dreadshade. Why do we bother investing 5 points into this node? It is because it also gives us minion critical strike damage leached as health. So we already get a percentage of their maximum health leached. This actually gives them generic leech as well, and at 20%, which is an insane amount. Then it increases all of their leech by 100% as well. That's coming through. So between this node and the node in the Summoned Skeletal Mage, that gives them all of their sustain that they will ever need. So that's why we do the investment in there, even though we already have 100% increased critical strike chance. Next up, we'll be grabbing the 10 points into Moonlight Pyre. That is going to give all of our minions 10 flat fire and 10 flat necrotic damage. The flat fire still applies to all of our damage, even if it's necrotic. It just doesn't scale as well as the necrotic damage. So that's still 20 flat damage, though, which is an insane multiplier. Next up, we'll be taking the 3 points into Heresy for the 3 intelligence. We don't care about the minion critical strike chance there, but the intelligence is nice, as well as it gives us access to our next point here, Blades of the Forlorn. So that's going to give us 70% minion critical strike multiplier, and 70% increase minion cold damage, which is pretty nice. You don't get a lot of minion critical strike multiplier for very many spots. Pretty much the only spots you get it are from the uh, inherent values on a couple of pieces of minion gear from like the jewelry that you'll be able to get. So this is one of the few places you can actually get a large amount of minion critical strike multiplier. Next, we'll be filling out the remaining points into frantic summons for the additional cast speed for our minions and for ourselves. And then after that, we'll be also filling out the rest of the Tyrant nodes to give us 24% increased health for ourselves. After that, we'll be putting the 10 points into Right Among Death. What that will do is give ourselves an additional 30% necrotic res and 30% elemental res, and it will give our minions 150% increased necrotic damage. And then for the remaining 5 points, we'll be going over here into the Lich Tree, and we will be getting the points here for the intelligence and mana regen. I believe that's actually bugged. So it's saying only +1 intelligence and 2% mana regen. It actually gives you +1 per node. So even though it says 5 points, it's saying 1 out of 10. So it'll give us 5 intelligence and then 10% mana regen. So it's a little bit better than just putting the extra points into here, since we don't care about the critical strike chance at all. And it's also giving us 1 intelligence per node. Oh, there we go. Now it's fixed. That was a weird visual bug. But this one will give us the same amount of intelligence per node, but also gives us a little mana regen on top of that. So that's why we go for that node instead. And then that will wrap up all of the passive points. So hopefully all these synergies are starting to make a little bit more sense as we start approaching the gear that we're going to be wearing. Alrighty, guys. The next thing I want to go over is the unique gear that I will be using on this build. Just as a reminder, none of this unique gear is mandatory for the build to function. I have a full planner in the video description that will go over a complete setup without any unique gear whatsoever. So still fully functional without these pieces of gear, but I do want to show the synergies on how these affect the build and kind of the stat priorities to go through. So just like any of my other build guides, if you guys are confused, it shows 4 legendary affixes slammed on top of each piece of unique gear. I don't expect anyone to have 4 legendary potential gear to be using these. However, if you do notice, all of the tiers, the little T number on the side of each of these affixes is different from each other. I use this as a way to show the priority for what stats you want to focus on trying to slam on the gear. So for the last steps of the living, for example, the T6 modifier here is hybrid health. So that would be the most important stat to get. Next would be movement speed, then the minion damage teleport, and then flat health. So that's why I have 4 LP uniques on here, just to kind of show you guys different priorities on what to go for. Legendary potential is not required on any of these pieces of gear except for 1, which I will go over. And it's something that I don't even have a good enough one in my setup yet. So again, not very, very mandatory. So first piece of gear here, last steps of the living. What this does, if you're not familiar with it, is it drains a percentage of your current health per second, and it gives it to you as ward. So this is what's called a low life setup. So you still want to stack as much health as possible. As you can see in the planner, I have about 3,600 health. Because the more health that you are missing when it's draining life from you, the more ward it's giving you per second. So you still want to stack health, and you want to have no items that give you any kind of health regen or any kind of health leech to your character while you're doing this setup, because you want to be at 1 health basically is the ideal setup. You want to be at 1 HP with the biggest health pool possible to get the most ward per second. So that's what these boots do. The rest of the modifiers don't really matter on them, but you're mainly going for the health mods on the priority for the slams. The next piece of gear that synergizes very well with the last steps of living is the Exsanguinous. It's basically the same thing as the boots, but it gives you a higher modifier. So you drain 20% of your current life per second, and you get 20% of your missing health gained as ward per second. On top of that, it gives you a little bit of cast speed when you use a potion, and it makes you immune to bleeding while at low health, which is all the time. The priority for these stats is to get level of summoned skeleton, which also gives you minion damage, then to get percentile health, then flat health, and then minion health slammed on. Now, the next unique I want to go over is a newer unique that didn't exist when I first made this build called Ambitions of the Erase. What this does for the implicit is it gives you ward when you use a potion, and it gives you ward retention. Ward retention is really good to have. It also gives you +1 to level of acolyte skills, so that applies to every single skill on this character. It'll also give you a little bit of endurance, which seems a little silly since endurance doesn't apply when you have ward, and this is a ward item, but whatever. Then the really cool line that this gives is when a nearby enemy or ally dies, you gain ward equal to 2% to 6% of its maximum health, and then it does have a 2-second cooldown. So we're constantly having our allies die around us, and so that's giving us a massive percentage of ward. So for example, for like the zombie node that gives us the same thing, it's giving us a fraction of this percentage. This one does have a 2-second cooldown, but is a way larger multiplier of its health being given to us as ward. So really, really cool defensive item that they added for us. The next item we have is the Apogee of Frozen Light. This sword is so cool. It gives you so many different things for the build, and it's just an awesome looking sword on top of that aesthetically. So what this does, the cold melee damage we don't care about, but this is the unique I was talking about earlier when it comes to the levels of some of the skills. It gives you +3 cold to cold and necrotic minion skills. So because our mage is both a cold and a necrotic minion, it gives us +6 levels to him. Our zombie is also a necrotic minion with one of the conversion nodes, so it gives us +3 to him. So really awesome there, just a ton of levels for free, basically. The next part is it gives you a 24 to 38% chance for minions to chill attackers when hit. That's important for some of the other nodes here on the sword. So the next part, minions deal 14 to 24% more cold and necrotic damage to chilled enemies. So we have so many hits going off, the enemies should always be chilled, and then we're getting a more multiplier on top of that for both cold and necrotic, and most of our damage is going to be necrotic damage. And then the next part is when a minion dies all the time, you gain a stack of Frozen Vengeance. You can have up to 8 stacks, and they last 8 seconds. Getting a new one refreshes all of their durations. You're going to be at 8 stacks 100% of the time. We have so many minions dying that you'll never have to worry about stacks. And then this is one of the cool synergies. I thought this was going to be one of the most annoying parts of the build to try to keep this up, but this is actually my favorite part of this build. So when you hit an enemy with a melee attack, you expend one of your Frozen Vengeance stacks to grant your minions Frenzy and 24% more damage to chilled enemies for 8 seconds. And on top of that, it also freezes up to 8 nearby normal and magic enemies for 3 seconds. So since we don't have to have Volatile Zombie on the bar or our Infernal Shade, it gives us access to having a default Transplant and a default Harvest. Harvest is a melee AoE attack that we can use. I thought it was going to be really annoying to be having to constantly walk up to enemies and melee attack them, but it is actually insane that we are able to AoE freeze all of the normal and magic enemies on the screen. I didn't die on this build, I don't think, until like level 96 for the first time, even though it's not like a super tanky build by any means. Like, it's not squishy, but it's not really the tankiest build out there. And it was because of this sword, just constantly walking up to minion packs, swiping them really quick, and then just chain freezing everything was amazing. And then on top of that, you're giving your minions permanent frenzy, basically, and that 24% additional more damage multiplier. So this sword gives us 48% more damage, which is crazy. So this sword is honestly the MVP of the build. I've had so much fun with it. As far as the stats to slam, the most important stat that pretty much nothing else matters. If you don't hit the slam, go find a new sword and try to slam it again. It's not required for the build, but it's massive. Is get that minion spell damage on there, so it gives you an additional 25 flat spell damage. As far as the next stats, you do a little bit of cold damage with the build, not a whole lot, but you can't actually get necrotic pen on a one-handed sword. So that's why I showed that we get cold pen on there for our minions. Next, you'll just go for flat mana and mana regen. If you've never played a minion build, prefixes on weapons are actually terrible. They give you almost nothing minion related. So that's why we're just going for mana regen, even though we don't really need it. And then the other stat, the only other stat that gives us any impact at all is parry chance. You're hardly going to get any of it on there, so it's not going to apply too much, but it just makes you take less damage. So that's the sword. And then the last unique item is the Jorah's Obsession. So this drops off of the Temporal Sanctum boss, Jorah. Now, these gloves I'm actually not using on my current setup, and I'll go over why. They're really, really strong pairs of gloves, and if you can get a really good slam on it, it is definitely worth using. So by default, they give us some armor, they give us void res, cold res, and lightning res. So a ton of res for free. And then it also gives us up to 10 flat spell damage. And then the most important stat is stats on this item also apply to your minions. So that's giving your minion a crap ton of res and that flat spell damage. Really, really big. Now, in order for you to use these gloves, you must hit a percentage of current health lost per second, percentage of missing health gained as ward per second. If you don't have those on here, it's such a massive downgrade in your defenses. I don't think it's worth it. It gives you a crap ton of offensive capability for your minions and gives them defenses. But if you don't hit that slam, you just lose so much of your ward that I just wouldn't use them. On top of that, it is important to know that that mod doesn't actually apply to your minion. So your minion won't have his health drained and given him ward at all. So that won't actually apply. So don't worry about that portion of it. And then the next stat you'd want to get is cast speed, because that would give you cast speed to your minion. And then you'd go for armor shred. So this gives your minion additional armor shred and then hybrid health. So ideally, you'd want to get a 2 LP one of these at least, but 2 LP is really, really hard to get for Jorah's Obsession. It's a boss drop, so you have to farm that dungeon over and over and over, and it's guaranteed to have 1 LP on it. However, it's very, very, very hard to get a 2 LP one. And on top of that, that 2 LP, you would have to get the health drain and then one of these other mods. So these are more of an aspirational type of item. Most of you guys probably won't get a good enough pair to really use them, but I wanted to put on there because they're really, really strong. If you want to know what other kind of pair of gloves to wear, just look at the other planner. It's got another pair of gloves on here that you could put on there. So still really, really solid. So that's the other unique item and what we would use. And then that would wrap up all of the different uniques and kind of their synergies. If you don't have any of them, though, just use the other setup. I wouldn't use the low life items, the Exsanguinous or the Last Step of Living, until you get both of them together. So when you have at least these two together, then I feel like it is now worth to play low life, and you can switch over to this version of the build. However, until then, just use the non-unique version items there. All right, next up, let's go over the stat priority on the non-unique pieces of gear. So we're going to start with the helmet. We're looking for a Raven Crown. The reason why is it gives you a lot of armor, and then it gives you minion spell damage. It's like flat damage as the implicit, which is really, really strong. The stats you're looking for an Exalted, increased skeletal mage damage, increased minion health, percentile health, and flat health. Next, we're going to be going over the jewelry. Now, the jewelry is very important. You really want to make sure you're getting turquoise amulets and turquoise rings, because they give you an insane amount of minion damage. So this gives you minion damage and minion critical strike chance on there. And then you're going to look for an Exalted minion damage with minion health, the res that you're missing. So you get a lot of your necrotic res and poison res for free. So typically you're going to be looking for Ellie res. And then health on here if you can. The more health we get, the more ward we get, so it's just really good defensively. Next, we'll go over the rings. So we have the turquoise rings that give you minion damage, minion health, and minion crit multi. So this is one of the only other places you can get minion crit multi, which is why using the turquoise rings are so important. This is basically like an entire ring by itself, just from the implicits. And then on top of that, we're going to be looking for minion health and intelligence. Like I said earlier, intelligence gives minions health, damage, and ward retention for you, so it's really, really big. The reason why we don't go for minion percentile damage on these rings is because minion health actually ends up becoming more important to have on a majority of your pieces to help keep your mage alive. And then on at least one of your rings, you're going to need a good rolled T5 crit avoidance. So closer to that like 35, 37% roll. If you don't get a really high roll, you're going to need to get it on both of your rings. But you need at least one good roll of crit avoidance on your rings, and then you're just going for the resistance that you're missing. Other ring is basically the same thing: intelligence, minion health, Ellie res. If you already have all your resistances covered, then you go for health on the ring. Next item is the Opulent Focus. Now, there is another option for this. However, with how I felt like the build was scaling, I think Opulent Focus is the best. So what it's going to give you is it's going to give you a bunch of intelligence, which is really good. Ward per second is very underrated on low life builds. That gives you way more than 54 ward, basically. It's giving you a whole bunch. And on top of that, it gives you 86% ward retention. Slapping one of these on was a difference between like 3,000 ward or something like that. It's an insane amount of ward that you're just always having. So Opulent Focus is the defensive option for the setup. And then on the gear itself, you're looking for an Exalted ward per second, and then trying to get minion damage and minion health on the prefixes, and then whatever res you're missing. The other option for this setup is using a Lich's Scorn. This is a set item that drops off of a boss. So you would farm the Frost Lich Formosus to farm this in the Blood, Frost, and Death timeline. It's going to give you intelligence and ward retention. You're going to miss out on the ward per second, as well as instead of 86 ward retention, you're only going to be getting 18. Now, what this does is it converts Dread Shade to a cold spell. So instead of giving you necrotic damage, it's giving you cold damage. It gives you some frostbite, which we don't care about. Freeze rate, we don't care about. It gives you an additional 13 cold damage with spells and attacks per attached Infernal Shade for minions affected by Dread Shade. So that's going to give us a decent amount of flat damage since we are using both of those abilities. And then the big part is it gives you 1% cold pen for minions affected by Dread Shade per intelligence. So on this setup, you would focus more on trying to get intelligence on all of your gear, and it will give you a pretty good chunk of extra damage. With my current setup, it was giving me about like 25% more damage for my Summon Skeletal Mage. If you were actually heavily investing into intelligence more, it would probably give you closer to like 35% more damage. So it is a very large chunk of damage. However, you are losing thousands of ward on your character for not running Opulent Focus. And when you start pushing up higher corruptions, you're going to notice that by quite a bit. So, you know, it might be a cool thing to like swap out for bosses just to like nuke the bosses down really fast. However, I think the overall better choice is Opulent Focus, but just keep in mind that is an option to use. And then the last Exalted item we have is the Praetorian Belt for the extra armor it gives. Now, the stats that you're looking for on here is an experimental modifier that makes it so your potions now summon volatile zombies, and it also gives you minion damage for that node. I will have a section of the video. You can look at the timestamps on how to craft that mod onto a belt, so you don't have to randomly find it. You can put on the belt that you want. But then you're also going to be going for minion damage. If you don't have the experimental mod, just go for minion damage there instead, and that will be just fine. The prioritized Exalted Slam is going to be hybrid health, and then going for percentile health on there. And then for a sealed mod, if you can get it, you'd be looking for a 100% chance to cleanse all ailments on potion use. And then that will wrap up all of the Exalted items. Most of the other Exalted items, when you're not using the uniques, are going to be the same as the affixes that we're slamming on top of it. So yeah, it's just going to change like the different bases that you're using. So this one's going to be a Citadel boot. So just look over that. If you don't have those unique items, those will help you out. As far as the idols go, what we're looking for is we're going to be using 4 large idols that give you percentile health and ward retention. You can also grab, instead of ward retention, you could also grab flat health or Ellie res if you need more resistance. All of those will be good. They'll all give you generally around this. The ward and the flat health give you about the same amount of actual flat ward on top of your character. So just whichever one you can get your hands on, and you'll be using 4 of those. For the 1x2s, we're looking for double health on all of these. If you still need res, you can go for elemental res on here instead. However, that extra flat health is really going to make a big difference on getting as high a health pool as possible. Then next up, we have the blessings. Just to clarify, there's some blessing slot missing here. These slots are only for increased drop rates. They do not affect your character in any way, which is why I don't show them. For the first slot, you're going to be looking for Void Res from the Black Sun, just helping you cap your resistances. There's not really any other options that do anything for you. These all affect your character and not your minion. The other option that you could do is health, I guess. That's the only one that would really make any difference whatsoever. But I think getting the res covered for free from your blessing is going to allow you to get more health on your gear, which would in turn be better than that flat health. The next one from the Ending Storm, we're going to be going for ward per second. That is by far the best one here. Your other options, you could go for ward decay, but this will give you much more ward doing this than doing that one. So those are the only 2 I would ever consider on this timeline. I guess if you really wanted to as well, you could go for extra mana. That would give you more damage towards your minions, but I think survivability is more important for this build. Next, we're going for the critical strike avoidance from Raid of Dragons. So this is going to also determine if you need critical strike avoidance on 1 ring or 2 rings. If you have a good roll at 70% or even like 65, and you have a really good roll on your ring, it will give you 100%. If you don't have a good roll on either your 1 ring or your blessing, just get critical strike avoidance on both your rings. Next, for the Age of Winter, we're going to be doing physical res. You could also do cold res if you need it, but most of the stuff that you're getting res on, you're going to be getting LE res versus one particular res. So your cold res is probably going to be fine. So it'd be better just to focus on getting the physical res. Those would really be the only 2 blessings I'd consider. For this last one, we'll be going for minion damage. Again, you could go for fire res, I guess, if you needed it, but I don't think it really impacted that much. Or you could go for armor, but I would be going for the minion damage. And then that will wrap up all of the gear stat priorities, the different uniques, idols, and blessings that we're going for on the build. Alrighty, guys. Next thing I want to go over is just how to farm the gear and how certain gear drops. I know I go through this in pretty much every single video, so I'm going to make a little bit of a shorter and condensed version. But if you do have any questions, please just let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to help go through that a little bit more in detail for you. So the first important thing to determine is the difference if an item is a boss drop versus a random drop, because that's going to determine how you farm them. You can tell all of this inside of the build planner. If you hover over each of the items at the very bottom, it tells you where it drops. So it'll have a boss name if it's from a boss. It'll say a timeline if it's from just like a random drop. So the uniques here on the left are all boss drops. Obviously, this is the offhand I talked about that you could use in place of an opulent. I would still use an opulent, but if you wanted to, this one's a boss drop. The ones on the right are a random drop. So what that means is if something is a boss drop, it is not influenced in any way by runes of ascendance or by prophecies. So you cannot target farm them using those methods, which are the strongest ways to target farm something in the game. You have to obtain them from that boss itself. Even if you have a prophecy that says Jorah drops like 30,000 unique gloves, none of those gloves will ever be a Jorah's obsession. It can only drop off the natural drop chance from the boss itself, which is at maximum 1 pair. Prophecies don't have any impact. You can't use a Rune of Ascendance to gamble for a boss unique as well. So keep that in mind. When setting up your prophecies, I try to find generic prophecies, like such as ones that say kill a boss or kill an exiled mage, something that can be used in every single timeline. And then I go and target farm the boss items, and I use the prophecies to get the random items along the way. So the most important boss unique item would be the Last Steps of the Living. That you get from farming a specific timeline, the Blood, Frost, and Death. So that is the timeline you would go to farm those boots. It drops off the final boss of that timeline. That timeline also has unique nodes that will drop random chest armors. So that's a good way to get Exsanguinous as well as using prophecies. The Jeweler's Obsession comes from the Temporal Sanctum, which you do need a key to do. If you right-click the Temporal Sanctum, it'll take you directly to where the waypoint is at, the Temporal Sanctum, and you'll need to kill that boss on tier, I believe it's tier 2 or higher, can drop the gloves. And then the Lich's Scorn actually drops off the same exact boss as Last Steps of the Living, so it drops off the Blood, Frost, and Death timeline. Those are the 3 bosses. And then the rest of these, I would recommend using Prophecies if you are in the Circle of Fortune faction in order to target farm them, as that is definitely the most efficient way to do it. If you are not in that faction, you can look at the timeline it suggests on the build planner, which will have unique nodes for like swords, chest armors, or relics to help target farm them. Or you can use Runes of Ascendance to attempt to farm those as well by upgrading normal, magic, rare, or exalted items of the same type. So if you did it on a one-handed sword, it could possibly give you Apogee of the Frozen Light, or if you use it on a body armor, it could give you Exsanguinous. As far as the prophecies go, these are typically the lenses I use. So I use a refracting lens of Rhyme, a refracting lens of Wealth, and then I use whichever specific target I'm looking for. So if I'm looking for amulets, I'm going to use an amulet one. If I'm looking for body armors, I'm going to use a body armor one. So you can use these prophecies to farm these 3 uniques, and all of your exalted gear can be target farmed doing this, as well as all of your idols. So normally I try to get the uniques first, and then I go immediately into idols to try to get the best versions of those I can, and then go from there. So that's how I would target farm them all. That's the location of them all. That's the difference between boss and unique items. So hopefully that makes a lot more sense. If you need any more detail though, just let me know in the comments, and I'll happily help give you more information. Alrighty, guys. Next up, I'm going to show you how to deterministically craft the experimental modifiers that you want on a belt. So for starters, before you do this, there's one thing you're going to need to acquire, and that is a Glyph of Insight. Glyph of Insights do not naturally drop on the ground. There's only one way to get them. So how you would get a Glyph of Insight is you would need to seal off an experimental modifier that's already on an item. Every time you kill an exiled mage inside of a monolith or anywhere it would randomly spawn, they are guaranteed to drop one item that has an experimental modifier on it. So for example, we have a belt here that has an experimental mod right here. You can see it says experimental, and then it has the name of the effects. So that's how you can tell what it is. You can't ever upgrade these tiers by default, so that's another way to tell. You'll have that little line through it. So what you'll need to do in order to attempt to acquire these is you will need a Rune of Research. Runes of Research have like a 60 to 70% chance to drop when you kill an exiled mage, I feel like. You get them pretty easily. I have 438 of them, so those shouldn't be hard to acquire. And what this does is it seals off this one mod and puts it down here so you can put another mod in its place while still keeping it on the item. When you seal off an experimental modifier, you have a chance for it to also drop a Glyph of Insight at your feet. The higher tier the modifiers are on the item, the more likely it is to drop one. So this is a random belt I don't care about. I still have, you need at least one forging potential as well. But I still have 40 forging potential, so I'm going to increase the tiers of this belt just to up my chances as much as possible. Okay, so now we got it maxed out as much as it's going to go, and then I'm going to use a Rune of Research. And then it has a chance to drop it. So this one didn't, but if it did proc it, it would just drop it at your feet. So once you have obtained at least one Glyph of Insight, you're good to go. What we'll do next is we'll grab the belt that we're trying to craft. So this is the one I'm going to be crafting. And then you are going to pull up this website that I will have linked in the video description for you. It is off of Tunk Lab's website, and it is basically a calculator for determining what mod is going to roll on the belt when you change one of the mods to experimental modifier. So the first thing you need to do to fill out this calculator is it's very simple. There's 3 pieces of gear that can have an experimental modifier on it: gloves, belt, and boots. So we're doing a belt, so we're going to go to the belt section, and then you're going to need to put in the base type of the belt. So this is a chain belt. You can also determine that by hovering over it. So it says Cleansing Chain Belt of the Ox. So that's how you can determine what kind of belt it is. So we're going to go to chain belt and put that in there. And then you're going to need to input the different tiers on the item. So prefix tier 1, that's this one right here. That's a tier 1, so we got that. Prefix tier 2, we're going to put a 2 there. Suffix tier 2, we're going to put a tier 2 there. And then suffix tier 6, we're putting tier 6 there. There are no sealed affixes on this belt. Let's see right here. So that's the first step. So if we were to use a Glyph of Insight, which you can only use on a prefix modifier, by the way, you need at least one of these prefix modifiers to change, it would turn into this mod right here, cooldown recovered on potion use. That's not the one I want for my belt, so I'm not going to be going for that. Also, if you follow these rules right here, you can upgrade the tier of what the affix will be. So even if I use a Glyph of Insight on a tier 4 affix, it will not give me a experimental modifier that's tier 4. It's going to be determined on this. So that's why this modifier says it's going to be a tier 2, because it's by default tier 1, and I have an Exalted item. So let's go ahead and start crafting this belt while leaving one of the affixes completely alone. So the first thing that I want to do for my belt is I kind of want to try to seal off this ward and ailment cleanse on potion use, because that's a really good sealed affix there. So I'm going to switch this over to a Glyph of Despair and attempt to seal this. Okay, so I got the seal on there. So now I need to make sure that I change this where my prefix is, the one that was tier 2 is no longer present on the item. So that is a no. But now I have a tier 2 sealed affix right here. So now I just hit another one of those requirements on here. So now my experimental affix will at least be tier 3. So right now it's still the cooldown recovery on potion use is what we're currently at. So I'm going to continue crafting my item to change this up a little bit. So next up, I'm going to add in a fix I want on this prefix. That way it has a chance to upgrade while we're crafting. So I'm playing a minion build. So I'm going to do minion health. Okay, so we're going to change this back. So now we have a tier 1. Now, if you notice, it changed to a volatile zombies summoned on potion use. That's the mod I want because it gives me increased minion damage. So if I used a glyph of insight on this ward gained as potion use, it would turn into a tier 3 zombie mod, guaranteed on there. There are a couple other rules I could do to make it a little bit better. However, I can't obtain those on this current build. So +1 if the item has 2 suffixes that are the same tier. I can't do that since one of my suffixes is a tier 6 and I can't ever get this one to a tier 6. So that's not doable for me. And the other one is if the item has a tier 7 prefix. Obviously that would have to randomly drop. I can't craft that, so that's not obtainable for me. So this is about as good as the belt's going to get for me to get this a fix. So now that I know that, I'm going to switch my glyph to a glyph of insight, and I'm going to upgrade the mod I don't want to turn into a tier 3 experimental volatile zombie on potion use. And then I still have 44 forging potential left, so I can continue crafting this just like I normally would. So necrotic res isn't necessarily something I want, so I'm going to probably attempt for like health would be ideal. But as is standard for last Epoch, I am never lucky, so we did not get health, but that's alright. Let's switch this over to glyph and up this as much as I can. Alright, so now we got a pretty solid belt. We have a 6 mod belt with the experimental mod that we want on there. We got the cleanse, we got exalted health. That's a really solid belt that we could use. So that's just how you would go through and deterministically craft the experimental mods you want. It shouldn't take too many attempts to really get a feel for it and figure out how the system works. But let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'm happy to help give you guidance where needed. Alright guys, next up I want to show you how to import my paste or my loot filter and how to read the loot filter and how to adjust it in order to be a strict loot filter for very end game scenarios there. So first up, you're going to want to go into my video description and you're going to find where it says loot filter. Next to it is going to have a link for a pastebin.com link. So if you click on that, it is going to bring up this page right here. In which case you're going to want to highlight from line 1 of text all the way to the 2000 and what is it here? 2650th line. So make sure all of that is highlighted, and then either hit Control C or right click and copy to put it to your clipboard. Once you have that copied, what you'll do is go in game, and you are going to hit Shift. You are going to hit Shift F. Shift F is going to pull open the loot filter page. Once you are here, you're going to click the little green plus sign. Do not click Create New Filter, but instead click Paste Clipboard Contents. That is automatically going to import my loot filter. You can name it whatever you would like. So I'm going to put Skele Pop Video, and then you can put whatever icon, whatever color, whatever helps you out. And click Confirm. And boom, now we have the loot filter implemented. Now, how I set up my loot filters is I set them up to level with you. So I'm going to start out with, like, for instance, the weapon. It's going to have a scepter. It's going to have the base types. It's going to have the affixes. And it's going to be showing this rule from level 1 to level 21. So once you get to level 21, this rule will no longer work for you anymore, and it will start pulling those off. What that'll allow you to do is get rid of the old base types off the floor that are no longer useful, and only show you the relevant base types that are going to be a higher level that are going to give you more stats. So all of this is going to naturally fall off for you. However, there are going to be certain rules that I have instructions on. For instance, show endgame scepter. Uncheck after obtaining Apogee of Frozen Light. So Apogee is the unique weapon that we're using. So once you've obtained that, since this one doesn't have a level requirement on there, you're just going to go to this little box and you're going to uncheck it. And now you won't see any weapons showing up on the floor that aren't exalted. You still want to show exalted items because you need items to slam into the item, but this will get rid of all of the rare items that are showing on the floor. And you can do that with a lot of these. So some of these don't have a unique item that we're putting there, so they won't have an uncheck option on there. But right here, uncheck after obtaining Absanguinous. I have the unique item, I'm going to uncheck that. Uncheck after Last Steps of the Living. I have Last Steps of the Living, I'm going to uncheck that. Uncheck after Ambitions of the Erased, uncheck that. Awesome. Now, if you notice on this rule right here, it says show, uncheck all rules except the bottom 3 for loot filter. So everything that is below this spot, you are going to uncheck once you have all Exalted gear and once you have all unique gear. You no longer need to see any of the rare or magic items. So you're going to go through and you're just going to uncheck all of these. They don't show up anymore. And it said all of them except the bottom 3. So we're going to leave the very bottom 3 ones because the bottom 3 ones are the ones that show important affixes for crafting and the hide all rule that takes everything else off the ground. You're going to leave these bottom 3 and you're going to check everything up until this point. Now you have a strict loot filter. So this is for your end game, and this is going to show up all of the exalted affixes. These are going to show up with your idols, as well as the different exalted modifiers. So if it's yellow, it's going to be a tier 6. If it's pink, it's going to be a tier 7. If it's this purple color, it means there's 2 exalted modifiers on there. It's not necessarily for this build, but it may be a really cool item for something else. And that's how you import the loot filter, that's how you read it, and that's how you adjust it to be a strict loot filter. If you have any questions about the filter options, just let me know in the comments below, and I'm happy to help you guys out with that. Next up, guys, I'm going to show you how to play the build and kind of like the build rotation. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is summon your Skeletal Mage. You'll summon him. And then what you're going to want to do is apply a Dread Shade on him. You're going to want to have a Dread Shade up 100% of the time on him. The Dread Shade will last a lot longer than the actual cooldown. A good way that you can tell if it's up is if you have this icon here. So this will show you if you have an active Dread Shade. If this icon isn't showing, it means you need to reapply. So I try to reapply right around the cooldown, but it'll give you a little bit of a grace window because it lasts longer than the cooldown itself. You can still see it's still up right now, and it's been off cooldown for quite a while. So good rule of thumb, though, just try to put it back up right when it's falling or the cooldown comes up, just to make sure it never falls off, because this is giving you a massive benefit. The other good thing to know is when you're aiming Dread Shade, you don't want to aim at the top of your minion. You actually want to aim right at its feet, and it's going to be more likely to hit the correct minion, because you only ever want to apply Dread Shade on your summoned Skeletal Mage, not your other minions. So other than just summoning him and applying Dread Shade every like 20 or so seconds, basically what you're doing is you're just spam casting Summon Skeletal Warrior. You can notice my Summon Skeleton Mage, he stopped casting his normal projectiles. If there is ever a minion for him to attack, he will always attack that minion and blow him up over doing anything else. So that's essentially 90% of the gameplay here. Putting Dread Shade on when it's off cooldown, so he has a 100% crit chance, and just spamming Summon Skeletal Warrior. Up here in the top right, it's going to show you the amount of Summon Skeletal Warriors that you currently have active. So right now I have 6. It can go up to 9 once you have all of the passive points. So you don't ever want to be casting if it's above 9, because otherwise you're just wasting mana. And you're getting your mana back every time they die. So you can see most of the time I'm at full mana. As long as I just tap it, every time it gets to about like 5 or 6, then it will keep going for me. The summoned Volatile Zombies are summoning by themselves. The Infernal Shades are summoning by themselves as well. So you don't have to worry about any of that. The only other part of the build to do here is Harvest. Harvest is going to proc your Frozen Light Sword to give your minions more damage and to freeze enemies. So as long as you have 1 Frozen Vengeance stack, which you should always have, you will just occasionally go up to a target and whack them. And then that will increase your damage of your Skeletal Mage by a ridiculous margin. And that is basically the whole build. Summon Skeletal Warriors, occasionally melee something, and cast Dread Shade on your Mage occasionally, like every 20 seconds. And that's how you play the build. You can use Transplant just to kind of like teleport yourself around if you need to. But that's it. That's the whole build. Very simple to play, very satisfying visually, just a really good all-around build. All right, and then last thing, guys, here before we do the outros, I just want to go over some common questions that I get a lot when I'm playing the build, and just address those. So the first thing is in my build rotation showcase, why was my mana so scuffed? So I'd actually taken off a bunch of my gear to show you guys where to farm gear, and apparently I was missing 5 points out of my Summon Skeletal Warrior. So I was missing a whole bunch of the mana efficiency and the mana. So the mana is not that bad in the build. I just forgot to put those points back in, so you should have 0 mana issues when playing the build. Second question. Why don't I have Summons a Volatile Zombie on my bar or Infernal Shade on my bar? Instead, I have a Transplant and a Harvest. So Volatile Zombie, like I said in the skill tree, is automatically being cast whenever a minion dies. My Summon Skeletons are always dying. My Summon Volatile Zombie is also casting Infernal Shade whenever it dies, so I don't need to ever cast Infernal Shade. It's doing it automatically. So instead, I have a base teleport ability, so I still have some kind of movement skill, and I have a melee ability to proc Frozen Light Sword. So that way I can just go up and whack stuff. I don't need it to be spec'd out and do anything else for me to get that benefit. So those are probably the most common questions I get in the build. Everything else is really simple. As long as you watch the build rotation part, everything's going to make sense. Super easy build to play. But if you guys have any additional questions, let me know in the comments below. I'm happy to help out, or you can jump by the live stream. I'm there, 6 days a week. I normally am live Monday through Saturday from 10:30 Mountain Time through till about like 5 to 7 hours, depending on how busy it is during that current cycle. Right now, I've swapped my days off, so I'm taking Saturday off and streaming Sunday just while my kiddo's in soccer, but that should only be for another week or two. And then I'll change it back to just doing Monday through Saturday. So that's my stream schedule. If you guys did like the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a ton, getting my video shown to more people and letting you know whenever I have new content. If there's a new build or a build you guys want to see me make, or a character you want to see me make, let me know in the comments. That way I can get a gauge for what kind of content you guys are looking for, and I'm happy to make that happen. So we've got tons of builds in the work. I don't always make build guides based on the builds I make on stream. I have a certain criteria of like minimum benchmarks that I want a build to hit in order for me to make a build guide. So you may see me play something on stream and it doesn't end up actually making it to a full guide. But I'm still happy to share those planners with you guys if you just come to live stream and ask. I just want to make sure I'm only giving you guys quality content out there and stuff that's really going to lead you to success in this game. So I love all of you guys. Thank you guys so much for your support, and I will catch you in the next one.